a movie, a game, a TV show, one of the best-selling graphic novels of all time. Today, we know Scott Pilgrim as a groundbreaking, successful media empire. But 20 years ago, creator Brian Lee O'Malley was struggling to sell even 500 copies of this very same comic. The day after it came out, he quit doing comics full-time and got a job at a restaurant. So what happened in between? What is it about Scott Pilgrim that has given it such an enduring, universal appeal? Well, to answer that question, of course, I reread the comics and trolled through ancient LiveJournal posts, but I also interviewed Brian Lee O'Malley himself to help unpack the complex, winding history of Scott Pilgrim, and I found more than a few surprises along the way. Let's go back to 2004, San Diego Comic-Con. 95,000 people have swarmed the convention center. This was the beginning of Hollywood's takeover of the con. Nickelodeon previewed Avatar: The Last Airbender, audiences saw the first trailer for Batman Begins, and Pixar previewed The Incredibles. And over in Artist Alley, unknown Canadian cartoonist Brian Lee O'Malley sat at his small folding table with no copies of his comic to sell. O'Malley should have had dozens of copies of his new book, Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life, but he had missed his deadline by an hour, and given that he was an unknown Canadian cartoonist, the printer had bumped him for a bigger job. But the tickets to San Diego were booked, the table was paid for, and so now here he was, sitting next to comic superstar Mike Allred with nothing to show for himself. Sure, he had a few copies of his first graphic novel, Lost at Sea, but it hadn't exactly been a huge hit. And he was in trouble because the pre-orders for Scott Pilgrim were even lower. In total, retailers across the United States and Canada had ordered fewer than 500 copies. Comics had been O'Malley's dream, but it had turned into a disaster. So after the convention, he asked a friend to take pity on him and help him find a real job. A few weeks later, the day after Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life finally came out, he started work as a food runner in a local restaurant. But that's not how this story ends. See, comics had been O'Malley's dream for too long. Since his first Archie comic from the grocery store, he had been infatuated with comics. He struggled at school, but excelled at drawing. He could express himself in his art the way he couldn't around other kids. And so comics became his obsession, his passion. And then, at 14 years old, he made the discovery that would change his life. It was a profile of superstar artist Jim Lee in Wizard magazine. It clicked for him that Lee is Korean and O'Malley's mom is Korean. They even had the same last name. Maybe comics could be more than just a hobby. Maybe they could be a career. After high school, he enrolled in film school, but he didn't last long. The pull of comics was too strong. He dropped out of school to follow some friends to California to help them work on their comic, learning the business from them and even lettering a few of their issues. He eventually moved back to Canada and used his lettering skills to get a job at Oni Comics. He got a day job at a comic store and would spend his whole paycheck on comics, practicing drawing and learning everything he could about the medium. Finally, his break came. Oni hired him to do fill-in art on one of their big series. It was a struggle, he fell behind schedule, but eventually he got it done. And he used that experience to convince Oni to publish a graphic novel that he not only drew, but also wrote, Lost at Sea. Lost at Sea is an interesting book, a road trip and coming-of-age story about a shy high school girl. It gets labeled as emo a lot, and while that's not inaccurate, it's also kind of reductive. And while the sales are okay, O'Malley still has a more serious problem with Lost at Sea. When he shows it to his friends, they aren't that into it. It's downbeat and personal, and they aren't really sure how to react. But O'Malley, he takes it as a challenge. He decides that his next comic will be the opposite of Lost at Sea. It will be made specifically for his friends. It'll reflect their sense of humor, the kind of issues they face, their lives in Toronto. He'll even base some of the characters on them and fill it with references to the video games and movies and music that they like. This is such an important point. Scott Pilgrim is a comic made for O'Malley himself and for a handful of his friends. But while his friends might have gotten a kick out of it, as we know, Scott Pilgrim ended up with O'Malley working at a restaurant. But he still wasn't able to shake off that dream of making comics. He would bring his notebook with him to the restaurant, sketching ideas for Scott Pilgrim Volume 2 while he was on break. Eventually, O'Malley decided to do something crazy. He quit his job at the restaurant. He and his wife moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where they could live more cheaply. He left his whole life behind to commit himself to making Scott Pilgrim Volume 2 happen. So while O'Malley works, let's head over to Hollywood, where Edgar Wright is screening his upcoming movie Shaun of the Dead at Raleigh Studios. Shaun of the Dead had been a hit in the UK and was about to open in the US, and word was already spreading among the nerd communities about this hilarious movie filled with references to pop culture and other media. And after the screening finished, 23-year-old producer Jared LaBeouf ran up to Edgar Wright and pushed a manila envelope into his hands. "This is going to be your next movie," he said. When Wright opened the envelope, he found a copy of Scott Pilgrim Volume 1. A few weeks later, in his tiny home in Halifax, as O'Malley worked away on Volume 2 of Scott Pilgrim, his phone rang. On the other end was an energetic British man, calling from the back of a taxi as he zipped between meetings in London. It was Edgar Wright. He had loved Scott Pilgrim, and he wanted to direct the movie. But even beyond that, the two just hit it off.
Like, I just did this stupid little comic, and now, like, I found this like kindred spirit who might be interested in it. Like, it seemed like such a pipe dream, but it was very motivating, I think. Like, at least I knew I had one reader, and he was like a cool guy.
Energized, O'Malley finished the second volume of Scott Pilgrim. To launch the book, he headed to the Toronto Comic and Art Festival, and the show was a mess. It was being held in the parking lot of Honest Ed's, a discount store in Toronto and a location in Scott Pilgrim, but it was pouring rain and tents had to be set up to keep the attendees dry.
I was sitting there like in a tent in the rain, and like 100, 200 people lined up to get Scott Pilgrim book 2, and like I had no idea there was an audience.
See, there's something special about Scott Pilgrim. Even though it only sold a few hundred copies at that point, a huge portion of readers were already obsessed, were willing to stand out in the rain to meet O'Malley and get the second book a few weeks early. Something was happening. Soon, Edgar Wright was visiting Toronto and putting O'Malley up in lavish hotels, where Wright, O'Malley, and writer Michael Bacall would sit out on the balcony late into the night, looking over O'Malley's new pages and bouncing around ideas for a movie.
I feel like it was the first time I used like a key card to use an elevator, like still like fancy world, First time I kind of entered into like, oh, this is like what Hollywood people live like.
As exciting as that was, the reality of a movie happening was still pretty remote. Edgar Wright had moved on to Hot Fuzz instead of Scott Pilgrim, and the plans for the movie kept changing.
For a couple of years or months, they were floating Seth Rogen because he had blown up. It felt like it was going to become like very different, very out of my hands, like very like 2000s studio comedy, kind of like big Hollywood, and like I would have to take their money because I was poor, and they would do whatever they wanted.
So while Hollywood churned, O'Malley returned to his books. And with each new book he released, the sales grew. Word spread. The earlier volumes were getting reprinted as more and more new fans discovered the series. Scott Pilgrim has an addictive, powerful quality, the kind that makes it spread from person to person, that inspires people to push it on their friends and famous directors. So before we get to all the craziness that comes next, let's actually take a look inside this book and see what makes it so special. Here's the thing. Scott Pilgrim should not exist. It combines techniques and ideas that have no business being together. But like a slice of cheese on top of apple pie, it shouldn't work, but it does. When talking about influences on Scott Pilgrim, the first thing you usually hear is about manga. And yes, O'Malley was an early reader of manga, driving to multiple bookstores to find copies of Ranma 1/2 before most people even knew what the word manga meant. But he wasn't content to just copy that style. Heavily inspired by Paul Pope, an American artist who had worked in Japan, O'Malley was looking at ways to combine manga storytelling with Western sensibilities. See, what I think many people overlook is just how much Scott Pilgrim is part of another comic tradition, Canadian autobiographical comics. In the late 80s, cartoonist Joe Matt had broken new ground by writing embarrassing, confessional, and really very funny autobiographical comics about him and his boring life. Soon, Canadian cartoonists like Seth, Chester Brown, and Julie Doucette were following in his footsteps, using their precise cartooning to depict ordinary life in an evocative manner. In the lead up to Scott Pilgrim, this unlocked something for O'Malley. He realized that his story didn't need to be set somewhere crazy, it could be set right in Toronto. It could be about him and his friends and their lives. It could feature characters who are imperfect, flawed, and human. And for the first 100 pages or so of Scott Pilgrim, it feels like it could be filed along with these other confessional autobiographical indie comics. But then, 125 pages in, this happens. Yeah, it turns into a battle manga, where Scott Pilgrim needs to defeat Ramona Flower's 7 evil exes. O'Malley even took the structure of the book from the satirical Even a Monkey Can Draw Manga, which says that manga is just a series of fights against stronger opponents. And yeah, it works. But this is the magic trick of the whole thing, because unlike manga, that structure is really only the thread on which is hung a bunch of relatable human drama. Even in the later volumes, the actual fighting and plot is mostly just an excuse for these character moments. This is the cheese on the pie. Two great flavors that don't make sense together, but work to create something entirely new.
It was like, oh, look at this hilarious joke of me, the indie cartoonist, doing this kind of like mainstream leaning thing. Like, no one's gonna like this.
This was a huge risk for O'Malley. This comic, with its video game references and epic fights, is way too mainstream to appease the indie comic community.
I won an award on the first book that Seth designed the award. He personally handed it to me, and I felt like he did not like Scott Pilgrim. That was my feeling at the time. There was just a whiff of like distaste, like this is gonna win my beautiful award that I made. I always felt like I didn't deserve it on some level.
But just as he was alienating indie comic readers, how was a book that looked like this supposed to compete with shiny, full-colored superhero comics? It's easy to see why initial orders were so low. Retailers didn't know who this book was for. But then something happened. The people who read it got obsessed. And that's because Scott Pilgrim is so much more than the sum of its influences. This is probably a good time for me to mention that I'll put links to buy everything down below, including these new 20th anniversary hardcover editions that Oni generously sent me. They're unreasonably beautiful. There's already a lot of videos out there analyzing the story of Scott Pilgrim, so I won't retread those grounds. Instead, I want to look at exactly how that story is told. Let's look at it this way. A movie can have a great script, but it can be made or broken by the performances of the actors who bring that script to life. I'd argue that the same is true for comics. And further, that Scott Pilgrim has some of the best actors to ever step on page. A lot of comics are lucky to have one iconic, memorable character, but Scott Pilgrim, Ramona Flowers, Knives Chow, Wallace Wells, Kim Pine, I mean, virtually every character feels like someone you know, even after only a single volume. What the heck is going on? Well, it's easy to look at the simplicity of O'Malley's art and miss all the craft. But if we track O'Malley's artistic evolution, we can see that the simple style of Scott Pilgrim is actually the result of years of refinement and experimentation. As we go through his work, watch how the faces get simpler, the eyes and mouths get bigger, the noses more or less disappear. He's not only moving down Papa Scott McCloud's chart of abstraction, but he's creating faces honed to convey emotion. And then he puts those designs to work. O'Malley is simply a funny writer. He has a gift for writing dialogue that is easy to follow, but just a bit off kilter without ever really feeling twee or overbaked. But if it were just good writing, I don't think Scott Pilgrim would have found the level of success that it did. But almost every single line is paired with a great facial expression, a performance by an actor that sells the joke or dramatic moment perfectly. And then finally, he puts it all together with this impeccable sense of timing. Just like on stage or in movies, comedy in comics is about timing. But the comic medium doesn't control timing like those mediums. So O'Malley uses the tools at his disposal. Layouts, eye trace, the careful division of actions and words across space and borders to create a sense of time. Like the 2 pages where Scott first talks to Ramona is an iconic moment. The line, "I'll leave you alone forever now," it's a good punchline, but it's played up because of the great facial expressions in that panel, as well as in the 2 silent panels that lead up to it, to give this whole scene a very particular sense of timing. This level of craft, beyond just the writing, it's why these characters feel so real. It's why so many people connect so strongly to this book. It's why each book spread like wildfire, because you don't just read Scott Pilgrim, you get invited to live in its world with these characters. And it's why you need to force your friends to read it, so they can come hang out with you and these characters too. But all of that friend-to-friend sharing was empowered by one important thing: the internet. The importance of the internet to Scott Pilgrim can't really be overstated. O'Malley was part of the first generation of kids who grew up with the internet. He had connected with other anime and manga fans online. He'd posted his first comics to his website. He was part of the emerging so-called geek culture that was at this very moment crystallizing online. So yeah, while all the references to other media is probably the least remarkable thing about Scott Pilgrim today, when movies like Deadpool are huge blockbusters, it was a pretty big deal for this mainly online community to see their interests reflected back to them in a comic. So not only does this book make online kids feel seen, not only is it an incredibly emotionally engaging experience that you want to share with friends, but it exists in a world where, for the first time at scale, people are sharing things over the internet. A decade earlier, those kind of conversations only happened at a comic shop. That's how people found out about Bone or Sandman. But not only were people talking about Scott Pilgrim online, but because it was released as a graphic novel and not a periodical comic, you could hear about it on a forum and go order a copy from Amazon without ever leaving your computer. This was revolutionary.
Man, those were the days. This video has me feeling real nostalgic. Oh, you don't know me. My name's I've been a hacker since the 90s. But because of today's sponsor, NordVPN, my life sucks. Back in the day, I was living large, swiping credit cards and swapping out letters for similar looking numbers in my name to show everybody how clever I was. Now, everybody's got NordVPN, the fastest VPN on the planet. But who's thinking about the hackers? Back in the day, I'd hit you with an email from Joe at Microsoft.com, and I'd be slurping down your savings account like a Capri Sun. But with NordVPN's Threat Protection Plus warning users about malicious links, all my favorite phishing spots have run dry. Back in '04, I'd go to the hip coffee shop, the one with the chalkboard sign out front, and set up a fake Wi-Fi and wait for you to join. But no, now Nord users' traffic is sent through an encrypted tunnel, and I can't get at anything. How am I supposed to pay for this double caramel macchiato I ordered? So don't go to nordvpn.com/Matt with 4 T's and sign up today to get an exclusive offer plus 4 months free. And don't even think about their 30-day money-back guarantee. Let me spell it so you don't go there by accident. It's nordvpn.com/MATTTT. Think of the hackers. Don't use NordVPN. Oh, you're going to sign up anyway. Go finish your video. This guy's okay.
So this is how Brian Lee O'Malley created a book, a sensation that from less than 500 pre-orders for Volume 1 had grown to an initial print run of 100,000 copies for Volume 6.
And it's just like, I want to make my friends laugh. I want to make my friends like me. So, so I made this funny little comic, and then, it slowly starts kind of like spreading out to the whole world. But
while O'Malley was focused on his comics, things were still progressing on the movie. After finishing Hot Fuzz, which turned out to be a huge success, Edgar Wright returned to Scott Pilgrim. Wright had resisted the studio pressure and got a movie into production that would respect O'Malley's vision. O'Malley had been watching the casting tapes, seeing his characters brought to life, and was invited to visit the soundstage where they were constructing the sets.
You walk right in and the apartment's there, all the drawers are full of stuff in the kitchen, and it was like what I imagined, which is based on what I lived. So like it was like my own twisted version of my own kitchen from a couple years earlier is now like built by people on this vast black kind of void.
But O'Malley, right around this same time, made a shocking decision. He chose to end Scott Pilgrim. This is another thing that makes sense in retrospect, but probably seemed crazy at the time. Comics, both Western comics and manga, have this tendency to be either incredibly short and compact or go on way too long after all the steam has run out. O'Malley could have kept pumping out Scott Pilgrim volumes year after year and kept making more money, but he stuck to his vision. 7 Evil X's, 6 books, because of the twins. O'Malley raced to finish book 6, finish his series before the movie came out. He released book 6 in July of 2010. 2 months later, it was time for the world to finally see the movie.
We had a party scheduled that night, Friday night when it came out, August 13th. And I saw Michael Cera drive by as I was parking and getting out of my car and going to the restaurant or whatever. I saw Michael Cera and we waved at each other, and then he never showed up. And that was like, to me, that was like the sign that it had gone wrong or something. But maybe he wouldn't have shown up even if the movie was a huge success. Like maybe he just wasn't in the mood, but like, I was like, there goes Michael. Oh, never see him again.
The movie was a huge flop. It opened third that weekend, behind The Expendables and Eat, Pray, Love. It would close a few weeks later, having lost the studio millions of dollars. Scott Pilgrim, the journey that O'Malley had been on for the past 6 years, seemed to be over and ending on a sad note.
I kind of like tried to duck out a little bit, especially after the disappointment. I feel like everyone kind of just went home with their tails between their legs. So it was very strange to kind of like feel like online had been poisoned from me in a way, like where it's like, you guys all know who I am now. You guys all have an opinion about me all of a sudden. It's like, you don't know me. Like there's certainly that like rejection, like where, you don't feel like this is real. But yeah, I definitely spent like the 2010s, like trying to distance myself a little bit.
O'Malley would spend the next 4 years on a new non-Scott Pilgrim graphic novel called Seconds. I do want to take a look at it, because not only is it really, really good, I think it's an interesting insight into where O'Malley was at. It swaps out Scott Pilgrim's disaffected 20-somethings for disaffected 30-somethings. The story is about a successful chef named Katie who seems to be living the perfect life until everything goes wrong. Soon, it becomes an exploration of all the mistakes Katie had made in her life as she's given a second chance to do things over. Without spoiling anything, I just want to read you this one line. Listen, this is what I've learned. There are things we can't change, and we just have to accept that. And maybe that is some kind of grace. Because during this period, it turned out that Scott Pilgrim wasn't over. Year after year, the books kept selling, and the movie was finding its audience as well. They started hosting midnight screenings at the New Beverly Theater in Los Angeles. Just like the books, the movie was gaining momentum organically, from person to person and friend to friend. Soon, it had become a genuine cult classic.
I remember watching it around 2016 at a convention. I had to introduce it, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to hang out and watch it. It was in the UK, and it was like, it was awesome. It was really nice.
And so, in 2020, a decade after he had finished the last book, O'Malley finally returned to the world of Scott Pilgrim and began developing a new Scott Pilgrim anime for Netflix. Soon, Edgar Wright and the entire movie cast had joined in. But instead of rehashing the material, it's a remix, a fresh perspective that I won't spoil, but it just feels like a celebration of these characters in this world. In that way, it's just one more reminder of how huge, impactful, and engaging that tiny graphic novel from an unknown Canadian cartoonist can be.
I just feel so blessed. Like I just like got so freaking lucky with, almost my first time out the gate, like just something that really connects with people and continues to over these years. I just have to kind of like try to honor that. Like, even if I don't, at heart, I'm like a little stinker and I just want to be like, nah, whatever, I don't care about it. But like, I do care. And like people's like responses to it really like move me regularly. So it's like, it means a lot to people. And I know how that is because like other stuff means a lot to me. Scott Pilgrim doesn't mean that much to me because I fucking did it myself. But other stuff, I get it. I do get it.
Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're not subscribed already and you like comic history, hit that subscribe button. Thanks to Brian Lee O'Malley for taking the time to speak with me, and to Oni for sending me the books. If you enjoyed this video, please like and comment, and I'll see you guys soon.